This is Business Law 431, the Business Ethics Workshop, Chapter 3, presented by Kelly Herzig. Chapter 3 is entitled Theories of Consequence Ethics, Traditional Tools for Making Decisions in Business When the Ends Justify the Means. Chapter 3 examines some theories guiding ethical decisions in business. It considers ethics that focus on the consequences of what is done instead of prohibiting or allowing specific acts. We will discuss consequentialism, utilitarianism, which is the greater good, altruism, which is about everybody else, and egoism, which is about just me. We will begin our discussion with consequentialism. Consequentialism ethics focuses on the results of what you do, not what you do. This type of ethics is focused on the goal, the end. It does not matter how you get to the goal, only that you do. Consequentialists are more worried about the outcome than the action. So the question for every given action is, what happens if I do, and what happens if I don't? The central ethical concern in consequentialism is, what kind of outcome should I want? Traditionally, there are three kinds of answers: the utilitarian answer, the altruist, and the egoist. Utilitarianism is about the greater good. As a consequentialism type of ethics, in utilitarianism, the distinguishing belief is that one should pursue the greatest good for the greatest number. Individuals can act in whatever way they choose, but whatever they do, to get the utilitarian's approval, the result should be that more people are happier. If that's the result, then the utilitarian needs to know nothing more to label that as an ethically recommendable solution. Utilitarianism is essentially a happiness calculation. Utilitarianism is true global ethics. You're required to weigh everyone's happiness and weigh it as best you can and as far into the future as possible. Now we're going to discuss the Ford Pinto case. It's an example of where utilitarianism can go off the rails. The Ford Pinto case highlights one of the problems with utilitarianism ethics. The greater good or the least harm cannot really be calculated. Remember that Ford wanted a cheaper car to compete with models coming out of Japan in the 70s. While the Pinto was in production, a defect in the production and placement of the gas tank, the neck, in the back of the car was discovered. In rear-end collisions over 20 miles an hour, the gas tank could rupture, spewing gas even into the passenger area. If there was a fire due to a spark, it could and did result in serious injury or death to passengers in the Pinto. This photograph is an actual photograph of a Chevy Impala rear-ending a Ford Pinto. Part needed to fix the problem with the Pinto's gas tank was only about $11 a car, but it would have cost $137 million in 70s money. Ford calculated the cost of doing nothing at $49 million. That meant paying for deaths and injuries, and that's the price tag they put on it. Now, Pinto owners would suffer $137 million in losses. Not that much per car, but many people would be impacted. And that's assuming that Ford could pass the problem on to consumers. More likely, under recall laws, under federal rules, they would have had to absorb the loss. Now, less people would be impacted, though to a much greater degree, and the cost was lower, which was $49 million, so Ford kept Pinto in production. Ultimately, in Ford's view, it was cheaper to pay the injury and wrongful death claims resulting from the Pinto catching fire than to fix it. On the legal side, the company thought it stood on solid ground. Government regulation at the time only required gas tanks to remain intact in collisions under 20 miles an hour, though in the end that did not protect them from lawsuits and a criminal prosecution. Why would it be acceptable under utilitarian ethics to keep the Pinto in production? The theory demands that decision makers stubbornly keep their eye on overall happiness, no matter how much pain a decision might cause certain individuals. It's all about the greater good. The problem with utilitarian ethics is to calculate what that greater good is. That's the big problem with it. There is, of course, another way to look at it. Ford made a decision to look at the short-term gain and ignore the long-term advantage of a more ethical decision. In Ford's view, it was better to put out a car with a known defect than fix it because it was less expensive and easier for more people to pay legal claims associated with the gas tank rupturing and the car being engulfed in flames during a rear-end collision. Now, at the end of the day, whether you believe in karma or not, Ford was highly punished for their short-sighted decision. It cost them more money in lawsuits and defense costs, plus the loss of reputation when the truth came out, than it would have cost to fix the car in the first place. At the end of the day, the Ford Pinto almost brought down the Ford Motor Company. Now, there are different versions or kinds of utilitarian happiness. Monetized utilitarianism attempts to measure happiness to the extent possible in terms of money, and that's what Ford did in the Ford Pinto case. Hedonistic utilitarianism posits that pleasure and happiness are ultimately synonymous. Proponents of this type of ethics seeks to maximize pleasures, just about any sensation of pleasure felt by individuals, particularly over the long term. Then there's idealistic utilitarianism, which opponents basically agree that ethics is about maximizing pleasure, but this more idealistic version distinguishes low and highbrow sensations. Raw, good feelings that both people and animals can find, such as in sex or eating and drinking, are second rate pleasures. Pleasures with higher and more real value include learning and learnings. There are different versions of utilitarian regulation. There's a narrow distinction, but it has far reaching effects between what is considered soft and hard utilitarianism. Soft utilitarianism is a standard version of utilitarianism. It's an act that is good if the outcome is more happiness in the world than before. Then there's hard utilitarianism. It demands more. An act is ethically recommendable only if the total benefits for everyone are greater than those produced by any other act. According to the hard version, it's not enough to do good. You must do the most good possible. As applied in the real world, that can have drastic effect for business. I mean, the rule utilitarian asks whether we'd all be benefited if everyone obeyed a rule such as don't steal. If we would, if the general happiness level increases because the rule is there, then the rule utilitarian proposes that we all adhere to it. It's important to note that rule utilitarianisms aren't against stealing because it's intrinsically wrong, as duty theorists may propose. The rule utilitarian is only against stealing if it makes the world less happy. Here are the advantages of utilitarian ethics in business. Clarity and simplicity. In general terms, it's easy to understand the idea that we should all act to increase the general welfare. Acceptability. The idea of bringing the greatest good to the greatest number coheres with common and popular ideas about what ethical guidance is supposed to provide. Flexibility. The weighing of individual actions in terms of their consequences allows for meaningful and firm ethical rules without requiring that everyone be treated identically, no matter how different the particular situation. And then there's breadth. The focus on outcomes as registered by society overall makes the theory attractive for those interested in public policy. Utilitarianism provides a foundation and guidance for business regulation by the government. There are, of course, disadvantages of utilitarian ethics in business. It's subjective. It can be hard to make the theory work because it's difficult to know what makes happiness and unhappiness for specific people. Then there's quantification. Really, happiness can't be measured with a ruler or weighed on a scale. It's hard to know exactly how much happiness and unhappiness any particular act produces. This translates into confusion at decision time. Then there are the apparent injustices. Utilitarian principles can produce specific decisions that seem wrong. There is the utilitarian monster, which is a hypothetical individual who really knows how to feel good. Imagine that someone of a certain group of people were found to have a much greater capacity to experience happiness than others. In that case, the strict utilitarian would have no choice but to put everybody else to work producing luxuries and other pleasures for these select individuals. In this hypothetical situation, there could even be an argument for forced labor as long as it could be shown that the servant's suffering was minor compared to the great joy celebrated by those few who were served. Shifting this into economic and business terms, there's a potential utilitarian argument here for vast wage disparities in the workplace. Then there is the utilitarian sacrifice. It's the selection of one person to suffer terribly so that others can be pleasured. Think of the gladiatorial games in which a few contestants suffer miserably, but a tremendous number of spectators enjoy the thrill of the contest. Moving the same point from entertainment into the business of medical research, there's a utilitarian argument here for drafting individuals, even against their will, to endure horrifying medical experience if it could be shown that the experiments would, say, cure cancer and so create tremendous happiness in the future. I've given you this summary chart of the advantages and disadvantages for utilitarianism for testing purposes. If you can't read it and you need a text only version, please email me. Now let's talk about altruism, which focuses on everyone else. An action is morally right according to the altruist and to the ethical theory of altruism if the action's consequences are more beneficial than unfavorable for everyone except the person who acts. That means that the actor's interests aren't considered. The altruist does whatever can be done so that others will be happy. Living for others means you don't have to live poorly, only that there's no guarantee you'll live well. All that matters, all that gets tallied up when the question gets asked about whether the altruist did good, is how things ended up for everyone else. There's a great example of that, Tom's Shoes. Tom's Shoes is an altruistic enterprise at its core in its buy one, give one business model for shoes. Bombas Socks is similar. Its model is for every sock purchase, one pair gets donated to homeless shelters. So let's look at Tom's Shoes and Bombas. It's easy to tally the results to show that others are benefited. For example, for Tom's Shoes, the relatively wealthy shoe buyers in the United States come off well. They get cool, politically correct footwear to show friends, along with a psychological lift from knowing they're helping the less fortunate. On the other side, the rural Argentinians obviously benefit because the shoes distributed there are freely given and help protect against infectious disease. Here are the rules of altruism. Altruism is a consequentialist ethics theory. Like utilitarianism, no specific acts are prohibited or required. Only outcomes matter. The ends justify the means. This explains why there are no lifestyle requirements for the altruist. The altruist does not have to practice poverty like Mother Teresa or Gandhi. One is considered an altruist as long as the goal of their lives and the reason for their actions is bringing happiness to others. Robin Hood was a criminal and a thief, but would be considered an altruist because he robbed from the rich to give to the poor. But like utilitarianism, happiness is difficult to define, measure, and predict in altruism. Altruism is a variety of selflessness, but it's not the same thing. People may deny themselves or they may sacrifice themselves for all kinds of other reasons. All altruists are selfless, but not all those who sacrifice themselves for others are altruists. Personal versus impersonal altruism distinguishes two kinds of altruists: those who practice altruism on their own and leave everyone else alone, and those who believe that everyone should act only to benefit others and without regard to their own well-being. Let's briefly discuss altruism in business. Altruism connects with business in three basic ways. There are altruists who use normal profit-driven business operations to do good. And then there are altruistic companies that do good by employing non-altruistic workers. And there are altruistic organizations composed of altruistic individuals. Here are the advantages of altruism. Clarity and simplicity. Now, people may disagree about exactly how much good a company like Tom's or Bombas is really doing, but the overall idea that the founder is working so that others can be happier is easy to understand and grasp. Acceptability. The idea of working for others grants an ethical sheen. No matter what you might think of someone as a person, it's very difficult to criticize them in ethical terms if they really are dedicating themselves to the well being of everybody else. Then there's flexibility. Altruists have many ways of executing their beliefs. There are disadvantages to altruism. The first is the uncertainty about the happiness of others. Even if individuals decide to sacrifice their own welfare for the good of others, how do they know for sure what makes other people happy? Then there's shortchanging yourself. Even though altruism doesn't require that the altruist live a miserable, thin life, there doesn't seem to be any clear reason why the altruist shouldn't get an at least equal claim to happiness as everyone else, as in the utilitarian approach. Also, some critics suspect that altruism can be a way of escaping your own life. If you spend all of your time volunteering, could it be that deep down you're not a good soul so much as just afraid of going out into the competitive world and trying to win a good place for yourself? I think that's pretty cynical about altruism, but it is out there. And here is the summary chart for the advantages and disadvantages of altruism that you can use for testing purposes. We will end our discussion with egoism, which is about just me. Ethical egoism is the mirror image of altruism. For the egoist, whatever action serves their self interest is also the morally right and ethical decision. What's good for the egoist in the sense that it gives them pleasure and happiness is also good in the sense that's the morally right thing to do. For the altruist, on the other hand, actions ought to heighten the happiness of others in the world, and what happens to them is irrelevant. But for the egoist, actions ought to heighten their happiness, and what happens to others is irrelevant. Now let's talk about egoism and selfishness. Egoism means putting your welfare above all others. Now, selfishness is not really the same as egoism, although they are related. Selfishness is the inability or unwillingness to recognize that there are others sharing the world or the refusal to see beyond yourself. You live in a world of one, you. Egoism is often regarded negatively. Self-centered, untrustworthy, pitiless, and callous with respect to others are terms often used to describe egoists and narcissists. Although we won't talk about narcissists because that's beyond the scope of the business ethics workshop. For an ethical egoist, doing whatever is necessary for themselves, regardless of the negative impact on others, is the key. Bernie Madoff can easily be seen as an egoist. He stole huge amounts of money from others to benefit his lifestyle without remorse, and from his perspective, probably the only problem was that he got caught. However, that does not mean that egoists always have no regard for others or are always selfish. There's no absolutes. Egoists are not against other people per se, they're just for themselves. But if helping others works for them, that's what they'll do. Now, just as egoists may help others because that serves their own interest, they also may obey customs and laws for the same reason. It's only important to note that they obey not out of deference to others or because it's the morally right thing to do. They play by the rules because it's the smart thing to do. They don't want to end up rotting in jail. But if they can get away with working the system, like filing for bankruptcy numerous times to keep assets and let subcontractors take losses, they do. They look for loopholes in rules to benefit themselves and can even resort to criminal acts like Bernie Madoff. Where egoism means putting your welfare above others, selfishness is the refusal to see really beyond yourself. Okay? It's the selfish person who's callous and insensitive to others and their wants and needs. For egoists, on the other hand, because working with others cooperatively can be an excellent way to satisfy their own desires, they may not be selfish at all. They may be just the opposite. It's all about motive. For example, the egoist may give large amounts of money to cancer research, not because of altruistic reasons like wanting to help cure cancer or to save lives, because it makes the egoist feel good and gives him or her positive publicity or adulation from others. There are two types of egoism. The first is enlightened egoism. It's the conviction that benefiting others, acting to increase their happiness, can serve the egoist's self interest just as much as the egoist acts directly in favor of himself or herself. That's the example of giving to cancer research, right? Or to charity. You don't give to charity or cancer research because you want to help others. You give money because it makes you feel good. You live in a world of one. So, as opposed to altruism, which claims that it's an ethical responsibility to serve others, the enlightened egoist's generosity is a rational strategy, not a moral imperative. Remember that the bottom line is that the egoist does not help others because they ought to. They help others because it will ultimately help themselves. And because this is such a rational strategy, it can be transactional in nature. A good example of that is the social contract. And this is a manifestation of enlightened egoism where one agrees to either act or refrain from acting in exchange for the same from another. For example, I agree not to steal from you as long as you agree not to steal from me. It's not that I don't take your things because I believe stealing is morally wrong. I leave you alone because it's a good way to get you to leave me alone. That's what makes it so transactional in nature. The other type of egoism is cause egoism. Now, this is similar to, but it is distinct from enlightened egoism. Enlightened egoism works from the idea that helping others is a good way of helping myself. Cause egoism, on the other hand, works from the idea that giving the appearance of helping others is a promising way to advance my own interest in business. Cause egoists fake it. They claim to be mainly or only interested in benefiting others and then leverage that good publicity to help themselves. I want to talk about a theory that people often use to justify egoism in business, which is something called the invisible hand. It was first theorized by Adam Smith in the late 18th century. The invisible hand is the force of marketplace competition, which encourages or even requires individuals who want to make money to make the lives of others better in the process. The invisible hand is a central point defenders of egoism in business often make when talking about the virtues of a me first ethics. Egoism is good for me, but it frequently ends up being good for everyone else too. If I invent something fantastic that benefits everyone else in society, I make money, but everyone else benefits from my invention. That's the invisible hand. Now let's talk about the rules of egoism. Egoism, like altruism, is a consequentialist ethics. The ends justify the means. There's personal egoism. The personal egoist in the business world does whatever is necessary to maximize his or her own happiness. What others do, however, is considered their business. They don't matter. Then there's impersonal egoism. The impersonal egoist believes everyone should get up in the morning and do what's best for themselves and without concern for the welfare of others. Then there's rational egoism. The rational egoist stands on the idea that egoism makes sense. In the world as it is, and given a choice between the many ethical orientations available, they think egoism is the most reasonable. Then there's psychological egoism. The psychological egoist believes that putting our own interest in front of everyone else isn't a choice, it's a reality. Maybe it's something written into our genes or it's part of the way our minds are wired. But regardless, according to the psychological egoist, we all care about ourselves before anyone else and at their expense if necessary. This chart shows you the four relations between egoism and business. Egoists in egoistic organizations, egoist in non-egoistic organizations, non-egoist in egoist organizations, and non-egoists in non-egoist organizations. There's the comparison, and I will let you review the chart at your leisure. This is something that you can use for testing purposes. Egoism is often considered negatively. Me first just doesn't seem right to a lot of people. But there are some arguments that others have made for egoism. First, clarity and simplicity. Everyone understands what it means to look out for themselves first. Then there's practicality. There are many ethical theories that claim to protect our individual interests, but each of us knows ourselves and our own interests best. We know what is most important to us. Then there is sincerity. It's oddly put for egoism, but there it is. For those subscribing to psychological egoism, there's a certain amount of honesty in this form of ethics. If our real motive beneath everything else is to provide for our happiness first, then shouldn't we just recognize and say that? Basically, shouldn't we say the quiet parts out loud? Unintended consequences. In the business world, the concept of the invisible hand allows egoists to claim that their actions end up actually helping others and may help them more than direct charity or simpler, similar altruistic actions. Then there is this interesting idea of respect for dignity. I don't really like this one, but it's out there. And egoists that expect people to look out for themselves and spurns charity may actually be demonstrating respect for others and acknowledging their dignity on the theory that charity is condescending to others. We don't give money to charity because it impacts people's dignity. There are, of course, arguments against egoism. The first, I think, is the main one, is that egoism isn't ethics. I mean, the reason we have ethics is because there are so many people in the world and in business who care only about themselves. The entire idea of business ethics, as the reasoning goes, is to set up some rules for acting that rescue us from a cruel reality where everyone is just looking out for number one. Egoism also ignores blatant wrongs. The rules of egoism dictate that even reprehensible or illegal actions like those of Bernie Madoff are recommendable actions as long as you can be assured that they'll serve your interests. Then there is the idea that psychological egoism just isn't true. The idea that we have no choice but to pursue our own welfare before anything else is demonstrated to be false millions of times every day. It's wrong every time someone makes an anonymous contribution to a cause or goes out of their way to help another person without expecting anything in return. Now, here is your summary slide for the arguments for and against egoism that you can use for testing purposes. If you need this in a text-only file, please email me. Otherwise, this is the end of Chapter 3 of the Business Ethics Workshop.